Hello, everyone. I'm Lydia Olander, the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University, and from the National Ecosystem Services Partnership that is hosting this webinar. So today we are very lucky to have with us a number of speakers who are starting off a series of 2 webinars with us on issues around equity and how they link to ecosystem services, concepts, and applications. And we're going to have a panel presentation today, basically 3 different people who have thought about this and included this kind of work in the research that they do. And we will have a second presentation like this coming up in a few weeks. Today we have Jacqueline Los, Benis Ego, and Leah Bremer speaking. They will present in just a moment. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to the partnership first. So the National Ecosystem Services Partnership started about a decade ago now in partnership with a number of federal agencies and others with the idea that we needed a broader community to collaborate and build consistency and communication on ecosystem services, both for how governments work, but also with the private sector and with nonprofit organizations and consultants. So the idea is to have a very inclusive community of practice. And since that time, we've had a newsletter, we've run a webinar series that this is part of. We have a website with a couple different websites with different information, an online guidebook we've created, as well as other resources with a number of experts, some of whom are probably on this phone call. So we hope to just kind of continue those discussions and dialogues and continue to provide resources that help the community move forward. So here's information on our next webinar. So if you're interested in continuing to listen, our next webinar is October 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern, and there's a link to register if you haven't already. So I'm going to turn this over to Sarah to kind of get us started. And talk a little bit more about this webinar and facilitate the discussion. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Lydia. So I thought I would just give a little bit of introduction as to why we're doing this webinar. So as the coordinators of NESP, we'd like to do our part to raise the level of dialogue on issues of environmental justice and equity and how they're tightly connected to ecosystem services and can be integrated really pretty explicitly into our thinking around social ecological systems. While the time is really always ripe for these discussions, we wanted to leverage the level of attention that these important topics are receiving right now, as the issues of racial injustice are at the forefront of the US national as well as the international conversation. So these webinars, through them, we want to highlight the different ways that researchers have approached and thought about different facets of equity that tie into ecosystem services research and practice to spark conversation and action in the NESP community. So while a webinar or 2 certainly can't begin to share the full breadth on this topic, we hope you walk away from today's presentation thinking about some new aspect of equity and ecosystem services that you might not have considered before. And we hope that the presentations and discussion can help spark ideas for how you might apply equity considerations in your work. So in terms of the webinar structure today, each speaker will spend about 10 minutes presenting on their focal area of equity and ecosystem services, and then we'll open it up to discussion among the panelists. So feel free to type questions into the chat either during the presentations or after, and we'll try to get to those questions at the end. We already have some questions submitted by participants at registration, and we'll intersperse questions coming in through the chat with those questions that have already been submitted. So with that, I will turn us over to the first speaker, Jacqueline Los, and I'll just give a brief introduction to her first, and then I'll let her take it away. So Jacqueline Los is a junior professor for research in the sustainable use of natural resources at the Faculty of Sustainability Science at Leuphana University at Lüneburg. Working in landscape sustainability science, her main interests are the relationships between the environment, biodiversity, and humans within social ecological systems. And she's going to be talking about how ecosystem services tie into the environmental justice framework.
So I'd like to thank you, Sarah and Lydia, for this great opportunity to connect to you at the Duke Nicholas Institute and the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, and also for this opportunity to meet Venice and Lea here at the speakers team. My intention today is to briefly illustrate how the concept of ecosystem services and the framing of nature's contributions to people ties into the environmental justice framework. By the way, this is part of our university. So just to show we have a nice environment here in Lüneburg, and hopefully some of you will visit us within the next few years here once traveling is allowed again. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge Martha Nussbaum's and Amartya Sen's work on justice and capabilities. Their work has inspired me as they tried not to ultimately define what an ideal state of justice should look like, but rather acknowledged pluralism by striving to improve injustice wherever possible to increase the ability of all beings to live a dignified life. Zen states in his seminal book, The Idea of Justice, if someone has the power to make a difference that he or she can see will reduce injustice in the world, then there is a strong and reasoned argument for just doing that. One of the reasons why I do not present one definition of justice is that people have different conceptions of justice and have disputed and argued over an ideal state of justice since many centuries. For example, some people may consider it fair that all members of a company receive equal wages, whereas others may prefer that those people that bear more responsibilities also earn more. Acknowledging this diversity of prospective ideal states of justice, we can therefore maybe more usefully focus on the actual and real injustices in the world, and work towards gradually improving this through our collective work on, sorry, this is starting automatically, our collective work on transformations as promoted by Joanna Macy and her spiral of the work that reconnects. However, even then does justice entail many different targets and dimensions. As an example, the internationally agreed sustainability goals are imbued with notions of justice as termed in terms of equity or fairness. Together with my colleagues, we have conceptualized three emerging justice dimensions, which also relate to the rationale of the ecosystem services concepts. Without going too much into detail here, in our article, we illustrate how the different aspects of ecosystem service appropriations can contribute to the overarching goal of sustainability outcomes in terms of intragenerational justice, intergenerational justice, and justice towards non-human beings, or so-called interspecies justice. In doing so, we caution that the ecosystem services concept in its foundations is closely linked to various aspects of justice and is therefore focused on sustaining human well-being. For many years, conservation has followed, however, an exclusive approach towards segregating humans from nature in a way that nature was considered merely as a resource provider from which, for the sake of wilderness, humans are to be excluded. This has and was widely documented in the political science literature, in many cases led to violent and poverty-enhancing political decisions to evict people from areas that were designated as protected areas, and systematically excluded local communities from the use of natural resources or also ecosystem services. Since the late 1990s, conservation of nature has moved away from its species-centered approach towards more integrated management of ecosystems, with the goal to maintain ecosystem goods and services for people's benefits. Amongst those benefits are instrumental and material ecosystem services, but also we observe a shift towards focusing on nature's contributions to people, rather than only using the ecosystem services concept in the formulation of conservation targets, which shows an increased desire to include the non-material and relational dimensions of contributions towards people, nature's contributions towards people, which are the things that connect people to nature. And these multi-layered and multi-dimensional relationships are complicated to conceptualize and difficult to measure, which might explain why still nowadays most studies look into distributive aspects of justice and material benefits that people appropriate from nature, or also in light of discussions around payments for ecosystem services. So in fact, much of the recent work on understanding environmental justice, both in natural resource management and in conservation, has focused on ecosystem services and more recently also on nature contributions to people. One common framework to understand justice in the context of environmental issues is the so-called environmental justice triplet, which you can see here. And this term, environmental justice, has come into wide use in the 1980s in the US, where it emerged as a movement. And nowadays it is also recognized as a concept in environmental studies. This triplet contains three dimensions. Distributions is about the harms or costs and benefits that are related to the nature that surrounds people and related to the conservation of nature. While procedure is about the way decisions are being taken and also asks who takes these decisions. So it's also about power dimensions in this triplet. And less prominent to date, but now gaining more attention, is the dimension of recognition. That is, respecting stakeholders' rights and recognizing the diversity of stakeholders' interests, concerns, worldviews, and I'd like to add also diversity of knowledge. So to me, this conceptualization of justice with these three dimensions is helpful because it is getting clear that most work in conservation and ecosystem services still account for merely one or two dimensions and rarely have achieved to look into the entirety of these justice aspects. And arguably, again, this is a difficult endeavor to do so. To this end, Phil Franks and colleagues have worked on disentangling principles that may guide the establishment, governance, and management, in this case for protected areas, which I think can partly also be translated for increasing justice in appropriation of ecosystem services or nature contributions to people. In terms of distribution, these principles entail the identification of costs as well as benefits, and to find ways to effectively mitigate the negative impacts for local people. The ways in which these services and disservices will then be distributed may follow equal shares or can be agreed according to the role of stakeholders and contributors to ecosystem services, their economic situations, or following legal and customary rights. The procedure on how to agree on this distribution of costs and benefits can be created transparently and inclusive to all relevant actors. Here, a fair process also means that responsible stakeholders take on the accountability to fulfill actions. Linking back to Amartya Sen, which I mentioned at the beginning, a fair procedure here means also to allow for discussions and to hear the voices of actors, so that the process of making a decision is already part of a more just ecosystem service management and governance. However, to do so, it is necessary to recognize and respect both legal as well as customary and statutory rights to ecosystem services, as well as respect to what people consider these ecosystem services to be. The recognition part in environmental justice explicitly calls for recognition and respect for the diversity of interests, capacities, powers, identities, values, and knowledge. So in a nutshell, my take on how we can move ecosystem service work towards more just approaches is by truly following a people-centered approach, which ideally should start with a better understanding of who bears the costs and who benefits from ecosystem services. For this, I recommend to routinely undertake stakeholder identification, as for which I can recommend the approaches provided by Mark Reed and Julia Leventon. And in the same charge, I recommend we move beyond familiar ecosystem services that many in our Western worldviews have conceptualized so far. As an example, I would like to highlight the splendid work by Ameline Valette and colleagues who did such a stakeholder mapping and also identify the different roles of actors on managing and appropriating, ecosystem services. Oops. Okay. Yeah, so again, I recommend we move beyond these familiar ecosystem services that we are used to from our Western worldview, and that we are more open to other types of values. And I think this means also that we need to apply more grounded theory approaches to listening, which elements of nature, if they are possible to be isolated at all, provide services to people or provide benefits to people. And such a mapping of values, possibly even spatially explicit, may help to increase our understanding of what decision makers should respect in their considerations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jacqueline. I think that was a really great foundation for us to start with. So just so we don't lose time, I'm going to introduce Benis Ego next, who will be speaking about commodity trade, ecosystem services, and equity. So Benis Ego is an assistant professor in the Department of Earth System Science at the University of California, Irvine. She's interested in the mapping and valuing of ecosystem services for understanding the economic consequences of land degradation on human well-being and the links between ecosystem services and underpinning biodiversity. She's also interested in the implementation of current policies related to biodiversity and ecosystem services and options that exist to safeguard or restore priority areas important for both. Benis, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Sarah. And thanks for organizing this webinar. Thanks to you and your colleagues. Thanks to Jacqueline for setting the scene so nicely to this webinar. And thanks to Leah for coming on board. I want to talk about commodity trade, equity, and ecosystem services. And I think this is a very good opportunity to share some of the work that we have been doing in that space. First of all, I just want to let us know that there are lots of social challenges associated with trade, and in particular commodity trade. And some of those challenges, some examples are like land rights conflicts, gender inequality, migration, child and forced labor. In this slide, which I stole from my colleague, Mariah, you can see that about 2 million child laborers are involved in the cocoa sector in Ghana and Sierra Leone alone. So most of these social challenges are concentrated around least developed countries, so poor countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. But for this webinar, I want to focus on palm oil trade. So palm oil trade, palm oil is one of the most used vegetable oils around the world. It's virtually literally in everything. It's in food, cosmetics, cleaning products, fuels. I can guarantee you that every single one of us in this webinar uses palm oil in one way or the other. I was really surprised one day that I was told that palm oil is in ice cream. And I was like, ice cream? Yes, palm oil is everywhere. So most people use it around the world. Because of that, the demand for palm oil has really increased from about 3.6 million hectares cultivated in 1961 to 2.1 million in 2017. And it's increasing rapidly. And palm oil grows in warm places, warm, humid climates around the equator in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. I'll show you some maps. So if you look at the top, my top left map, you will see that palm oil, like I've said, grows around the equator. You look at all the places where it's grown, which coincide with one of the hotspots in biodiversity. So one of the richest places for biodiversity are also places where palm oil is really grown or suitable. If you look at my left, my right, the top map shows the suitability for Africa, and the lower right map shows the primate vulnerability. So there's a conflict between palm oil cultivation and biodiversity. But for this webinar, and for the sake of equity, we look at the poverty index. If you look at my left, the lower map on my left, you will see that most of the places where palm oil is grown are also one of the poorest places in the world, okay? And oil palm cultivation comes with a lot of undesirable consequences. You probably must have heard about deforestation, because the forest is cut mostly to plant palm, but also there's a lot of issues around water. So there is siltation that comes with the fact that when you cut the forest, then there's increased erosion, and then you have eutrophication on the rivers, in the river system. But the oil itself sometimes drains, the waste is poured straight into the water body. So there's a lot of water pollution. There's land grabbing, as you can see from those photos in the middle. You have houses in the middle of palm plantation and burial grounds in the middle of palm plantation. So there's lots of land grabbing happening there. So we've just recently completed a review just to look at some of the social impacts associated with palm oil cultivation or oil palm plantations. And we found that almost every single ecosystem services is impacted negatively by palm oil plantations. We looked at the Environmental Justice Atlas, and just to see, this is an atlas where they report cases of environmental conflicts. And we just looked at those associated with palm oil, and we found that there were so many of them, and many of them reported impacts on ecosystem services. Of course, I've just mentioned soil erosion, 100%, all the studies, all the cases reported negative impact on erosion. And on my left, you can also see that there are also many other direct negative impacts from low housing condition, land grabbing, to land tenure rights, and employment, gender discrimination. I think in one of the studies we found a case of rape. So there are serious social, negative social impact associated with this, with the trade of oil palm. And just to make a balance here, I did not show the positive impacts, but in many of those places, you have large corporations that come in and establish oil palm plantations and build houses and schools and roads and bring some kind of development in the areas. But in this particular study, we are focused, for this presentation, I focused on the negative impact because they were really overwhelming. And to show again, these impacts are found in those places where they are grown, mostly in those very poor countries. In the diagrams I've shown, you can see that about 40 of the cases that we found in the Environmental Justice Atlas were from Indonesia, but you also had cases in Colombia, you had cases in Peru and Liberia, so across those countries. And if you look at my right, the map there shows where the cases are located, the location of the cases that have been reported in the Environmental Justice Atlas. But I've also shown in the literature, in the peer-reviewed literature, we also find overwhelming negative impacts that have been reported in the peer-reviewed literature, with the majority from Indonesia and Malaysia, not surprisingly, as 85% of production of global oil production is in those two countries, okay? I just dump here another map of environmental conflicts, which is over 3,000, the general environmental conflict map, just for you to have an idea of the types of places, the locations where those are. And what is worrying to me is that these, the studies or the cases have been reported in the last decade. So they are ongoing, even up to 2019, where we ended our study. We ended it in 2019, the search for our studies. We still had many studies reporting negative impact. So it is something that needs to look into, it's something that needs to be addressed. And I wanted to also just say that there are some initiatives that have been put in place globally and regionally to respond to the negative impact of oil palm trade. But most of the criteria that they have set in these initiatives are related or directly related to biodiversity conservation or other environmental impacts, not necessarily on people. Not necessarily on the communities, like the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO. They had just, I think, 1 or 2 criteria on local community rights. So while you have, in some cases, major big companies that are trading in Malaysia and in Indonesia, responding to the negative impact of oil palm trade, and committing to a no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation commitments, there isn't such in terms of the social impacts on how it does, how it impacts on people. There are few criteria, in fact, no, we couldn't even find any real landmark commitment to this, to lowering these impacts or addressing the negative impacts of palm oil trade. So we have this regional initiatives. You have one in Indonesia, you have the Malaysia one, you have a European one, which, so they exist, except that they don't focus on the social impact. We need to bring more of the social impact to light. So in line with the research, we are focusing now in Cameroon to try and understand the ecosystem services that are destroyed through the cultivation of palm oil. So before they cultivate palm oil, what are the ecosystem services that are generated by the landscape? Or if you want to call it, we can call it a cost. It's like a cost. So we're doing a cost benefit analysis in Cameroon to look at all the different issues in a smaller place. As you see, most of the studies are focused in Indonesia and Malaysia, so we need to do more studies in Africa, places like Ghana and Cameroon, where oil palm actually originated. And if you look at the graph that I've put here, there is an increase in terms of oil palm cultivation in Cameroon since the 90s. So we are looking at the cost and benefit, looking at the incentives, what is making people to invest in oil palm. We are looking at smallholders and large corporations. What are the benefits from the smallholders? What are the costs? What are the benefits from the large corporations? And what are the costs? Because we have a short time for this webinar, I would like to stop here. I just want to say this is part of a bigger project, which has about 50 partners in around 5 locations around the world. And I'll take this time just to pay tribute to Georgina Mays, a giant in conservation who fell on Saturday passing away on Saturday. May her soul rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benis, for that deeper dive into an example. And last but certainly not least, I will have us turn to Leah Bremer, who is a geographer and research faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She has a split appointment with the Water Resources Research Center and the UH Economic Research Organization. Prior to returning home to Hawaii 3 years ago, she spent 10 years working to better understand the social and ecological outcomes of payments for ecosystem services, including water funds in the Andes, through her work with the Natural Capital Project at Stanford. Her work now centers on watershed and water resources management and agroecological restoration in Hawaii, though she continues to collaborate with community partners in the Andes. And she is going to be finishing out our panelist presentations talking about connections between ecosystem services and place-based biocultural restoration, and the importance of relationships, showing up to community work days, taking a long-term view, and respecting the people, culture, and history of place.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Could you guys see my screen just then? Did that work?
No, we're not seeing your screen. Now we are.
Yes.
Okay. See. Now, do you see the full slideshow?
Yes.
Cool. Sorry. Should have Zoom figured out by now. Well, thank you again to Sarah and also to Lydia from the National Ecosystem Services Partnership for hosting this webinar. And it was really great to hear Jacqueline's presentation, which really set the stage, and also Benny's presentation and a deep dive into a really important case study. And I'm really also looking forward to Kai, Marta, and Bonnie's presentations in part 2. So, and thanks everybody else for being here. I was really humbled to have been invited to this panel. And when I was thinking about what to highlight from my work, I kept thinking about all the people I would want to present with me. And in the absence of being able to do that in 10 minutes, I thought I would just use this time to tell kind of 3 short stories about people and places that have inspired me in my work, and that I think offer lessons in thinking about how to better address equity in ecosystem services. So before I dig in, I wanted to start with this quote by one of my favorite writers, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a plant ecologist and citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. She's a foundational thinker on reciprocal restoration, or the mutually reinforcing restoration of land and culture. This is also increasingly referred to as biocultural restoration. So she says in Braiding Sweet Gas, restoring land without restoring relationship is an empty exercise. It is relationship that will endure and relationship that will sustain the restored land. Therefore, reconnecting people and the landscape is as essential as reestablishing proper hydrology or cleaning up contaminants. It is medicine for the earth. And a second quote I wanted to share is from a kupuna, or elder in Hawaii, who I had a chance to interview with a graduate student on restoration going on in Kona. And he said, the process is what is important. If the process is not pono, which is upright in Hawaiian, the outcome is not pono. So both of these quotes emphasize the importance of focusing not just on outcome, but on the process and relationships inherent in environmental restoration. So I was really glad to see Jacqueline already describe this framework so nicely, so I don't really need to go into it, but this framework has been useful for me in thinking about equity in ecosystem services. So as Jacqueline talked about, distributional equity, distribution of cost, benefits, burdens, and rights as a result of ecosystem services programs. This can also be who has access to payments for ecosystem services and other types of programs. The second two more process-based, so procedural, who's at the table, who has power in decision-making, and recognitional, whose knowledge systems, worldviews, values, and cultural protocols characterize the decision-making process. So the first place I want to take you is to the water fund Agua por la Vida, or Water for Life in the Cauca Valley. I saw Adrienne Vogel on the call. She's worked with me on this, and she made the map there on my left. I think it's on your left too. But now this is one of a growing number of water funds in Latin America. So water funds are collective action mechanisms where groups of water users and other watershed stakeholders collectively invest in upstream watershed conservation. So Agua por la Vida is one of the oldest water funds. It started in 2009, but built off of over 30 years of the sugarcane industry supporting upstream watershed conservation. So first lesson I learned working with this water fund and others, first as a postdoc with the Natural Capital Project, is that we really need to rethink dominant paradigms of spatial targeting of ecosystem services, which often focus on creating investment portfolios primarily focused on downstream goals. So while hydrologic and other ecosystem service modeling focus on downstream goals can certainly help to identify general areas of focus, particularly in the context of communities with deep cultural connections to their land and legacies of colonization, discrimination, and injustice, the actual planning and types of activities where and when to do them has to be at the community level. So here's an area where Agua por la Vida works that I thought this worked really well. So this is Doña Nancy, the Environmental and Economic Development Coordinator for her indigenous NASA community, and her daughter Linda Juena, as she writes on the board, which I learned means water source in the NASA language. I had the chance to interview Nancy, and I asked her why her community had decided to work with the Water Fund through an intermediary organization, Corpo Palo. She noted that we have always been very skeptical of institutions. They always come in and tell us what to do. She explained that this is part of a long history of colonization where we were treated as subhuman, not capable of making our own decisions. She explained that with Corpo Palo, it was different. They had listened first to what the community wanted, had gone slow, and had focused on building relationships and playing a supporting role. So they are now working with the Water Fund through Corpo Palo to achieve some of the community's own goals as defined by the community's life plan, which involves reforestation, highland grassland protection, and sustainable agricultural development. So this agreement never would have occurred between the Water Fund and this community if the Water Fund had come in with pre-existing plans or tried to make an agreement happen quickly. It wouldn't have been equitable and it wouldn't have worked. So this idea of how can we balance prioritization of downstream actors, but make sure that activities are designed by and benefit communities is really critical for effective and equitable ecosystem services design. And I know lots of folks are working on this, but I just wanted to highlight really the importance of these relationships and going slow, and that these projects be community-led. So the second place I'm going to take you is to a town called Huamantanga in Peru, about a 5-hour uphill drive from Lima in the Chillón watershed, one of Lima's 3 major watersheds. So as a desert city of over 10 million people, Lima experiences severe water shortages, particularly during the dry season. And there are widespread efforts to identify effective and equitable nature-based solutions. So I had a chance to spend a few days in Huamantanga with Fondo Lima's Water Fund and visit the communal highlands where the community had restored mamanteo systems, or pre-Incan infiltration channels, which they believe seed water during the wet season for the dry season. The community members explained that these mamanteos were critical for their agricultural livelihoods and had also increased community pride and stimulated cultural revitalization. So while the community was sure of the benefits of the project, including through a quinoa experiment where they dropped quinoa in the mamanteo during the wet season and saw them emerge during the dry season in expected places, they also supported a group of hydrologists in monitoring this process using tracer dyes. So the results of this hydrologic monitoring were published in Nature Sustainability and confirmed what the community already knew, and also suggested that if scaled up, these Huamantanga systems could have significant dry season flow benefits for the city of Lima. But of course, scaling these types of biocultural restoration approaches can't just take a technical approach. They'll need to really pay attention to the process and ensure that efforts are led by communities. So our final visit is to one of my favorite places. This is close to where I grew up, in the Ahupua'a, or the political ecological boundary of Heia, where community nonprofits are working to restore from Mauka to Makai, or from land to sea, from the fish ponds to the taro fields to agroforestry systems. So this area was recently designated as a National Estuarine Research Reserve, and the first of these reserves to focus on restoring indigenous social ecological systems and on understanding the links between biocultural restoration and ecosystem services. So working here, I quickly learned that the most important thing for a researcher to do is to show up to community work days, to get dirty and to do some of the real work of restoration. So some of the staff call this sweat equity. So one of my first projects in Heia, in collaboration with the community-based nonprofit Kakoa Iwi, was to pull together an interdisciplinary team to better understand the multiple outcomes of lo'ikalo, or taro restoration, including for sediment retention, for coral reef health, food production, and cultural values. So kalo, or taro, is considered the elder brother of Hawaiian people and has important cultural significance. So graduate student Casey Ching interviewed families by working alongside them in the lo'ikalo patch, or the taro patch. These interviews highlighted some of the most important benefits, which were cultural and relational values-based benefits of the restoration process, and none of these would have emerged in a more formal interview setting. So time spent working alongside staff and community at Heia also allowed us to create a collaborative community-based restoration, agroforestry restoration project, where we planted a mix of native and other culturally valuable plants. So we're monitoring changes in ecosystem services over time, but the real work and fun is in working alongside others in making the restoration actually happen. We pay a lot of attention to the process and intention of this biocultural restoration effort. Each plant placed in the ground is offered the pule, or Hawaiian prayer, Yola'oi, Yolamako. So I'll just end, I see I'm a little over time, with kind of 5 key take homes. So first, focus on the process as much as the outcomes, as process has a direct influence on outcomes. Go slow, build relationships, listen and be open to different perspectives and worldviews. Second, flip spatial targeting on its head. While ecosystem services programs, of course, need to work in areas important for downstream funders, within those areas, we need to ask the question of where ecosystem services programs can align with local initiatives and collective action, as these are the projects which will be most effective, equitable, and sustainable. Synergies with downstream goals will come from there. 3, support biocultural restoration efforts that amplify local traditional knowledge, practice, and worldviews. 4, show up, spend time working in the place, and not just for research and planning. You'll also learn a lot this way. And 5, there are many lenses to view and express relationships between people and the environment. Use the terms that resonate most in the specific context. And that's not always going to be ecosystem services. So thanks to everybody for listening. There's countless people to thank, and countless collaborators, and thanks again to Lydia and Sarah for organizing.
Yeah, thank you for those lessons, Leah. I think that was a great way to wrap it up. So now I will kick off the discussion portion of the webinar by posing a question to all of you that came in through one of our registrants. But if anyone else has questions about the specific presentations that they'd like to ask, feel free to put those into the chat box, and I can moderate those questions as they come in. But first, one of the sort of overarching questions I thought would be good to kick us off was, why do you think that using an ecosystem services lens is helpful for thinking about equity and environmental justice as they relate to management of natural resources? And I'll let any of our panelists jump in if they'd like to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I think I'll just give a short on my thoughts around that. Is that the scale at which ecosystem services operate is not necessarily, not always at a very global scale. When we think about ecosystem services, we think about people, local people, the people who are experiencing whatever benefits or costs. So it's about the people. It's, first of all, it's a link between the environment and the people. So the people are centered to ecosystem services. And when you talk about equity, you're thinking at people at different levels of maybe poverty or in different places experiencing different things. And also, when we talk about ecosystem services, it's linked to places because it's about the environment and where it is. It's linked to places, and those places are owned by certain people. And so we cannot really talk about equity without linking them to or ecosystem services without linking it to equity. It is almost impossible, because when you talk about, when I think about losses in ecosystem services, impact on ecosystem services, you can't talk about impact if you don't talk about people. And all of these people are not equal. It impacts people differently. And so I think that it's a good lens. It's a way, although we haven't really framed ecosystem service concepts in that light, but it's a very good way to look at it.
Thanks. Jacqueline, would you like to add something?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I agree with Benice, and to me, the ecosystem service concept also entails the idea to put a value on nature and to somehow show, to use this for a higher goal, and that is sustainability. So to me, it was useful to apply ecosystem service, the notion and the concept of ecosystem services, rather than just talking about resources, because immediately people would recognize that there are several categories of resources that can be used, or not even resources, but things or goods and benefits that would contribute to the well-being of people and that rely on a functioning nature. So that is, this is what I find helpful about the concept. And how it links to justice, I have just laid out in my presentation.
Thanks. And maybe, oh, Leah, did you want to add anything?
Well, should we wait till the next question? I guess I was just going to say that I think that's a really complex question, right, of the links between ecosystem services and justice. And I think there's been a lot of valid critiques of some types of ecosystem services programs. And even that framing of valuing nature can come from a certain worldview. But I think that there's also many lenses to look at human environment relationships, right? So I think of ecosystem services as it's widened to think about those different human environment relationships can help to better characterize those. But I don't think it's always the case that ecosystem services is the right framework to support certain types of injustice challenges, right?
Yeah, that's important to acknowledge as well. Yeah, Jacqueline.
Yeah, directly to that, I think related to that critique is also some development that we observe in the ecosystem service concept, but also the shift towards the use of nature's contributions to people, which is maybe closer towards recognizing the diversity of values that people may hold towards nature. And I would even argue that the isolation that we have often applied of individual elements of nature and ourselves may also not hold true for many people on Earth. So we may even further develop that concept. But again, I also think it's not so much about having an ideal concept to work with, but moving towards it. So it's a transformative, a process of transformation as well in the use of this concept.
Thanks. So Leah, I'll turn back to you. I think this question ties into some of the case studies that you talked about, but we have someone asking about how much technical knowledge does a community need to have to advocate for their right to equity in ecosystem services delivery? So I think sort of inherent in that question is, do you need to train people about what ecosystem services are or how to measure them necessarily for them to be able to advocate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's lots of different contexts of it, but the places I worked, I think there's a lot of local knowledge of where water comes from, and the inherent concepts of ecosystem services people understand. They're not going to call them ecosystem services, right? But people get that their water comes from certain places, and they want to protect those places for water and for other reasons. So I don't think that people necessarily need training on what ecosystem services are, or like in the case of the Huamantanga study, like the community was already convinced that the Mamanteo systems were working for their dry season flow, but where the hydrology helped was to help make their case to potential funders for the project, right? We often need that kind of technical data to make the case more broadly. But I think there's real opportunities for, like the Rios tool and just another shout out for Adrian, to partner more with communities that have decided that they want to protect their resources for their own water and have already established long-term collaborations with intermediary organizations like Corpo Palo or whatever, and that the community decides, yeah, I would like some additional technical capacity to help decide where to protect. And I think in some cases they'll want to do that, and in other cases they won't. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but those are my thoughts.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, yeah. I agree with you completely. For certain ecosystem services, the community, they know, they may not call it ecosystem services, but they know, they see, and I experienced that as a child. We saw the river disappearing. We knew that the erosion, the disappearance was as a result of the soil that was getting to the river, and because of the cultivation because we see them. So for some local ecosystem services, they see them. They see, for example, their food provision, for example, if you talk about wild foods, they go and get the wild foods. I was in Namibia for two months, and I spoke to the communities about the ecosystem services. I got to learn from them how they use the land much more than I could articulate it in terms of in the context of ecosystem services. They told me things that I didn't know. But in terms of quantifying those things, they may not necessarily have the tools to quantify, and that's where the partnership should come in. And I think this is one of the reasons also why IBES, the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is focusing a lot on local knowledge, because there's a wealth of knowledge that the communities have. And so, and I agree with Leah that if you interact with them in the appropriate way, you will get the information from them, and you can bring partnership so we can take what information they have and put into the tools that we have developed and quantify and support them and make it explicit, like what we are trying to do in Cameroon, to take costs on that, to put a monetary cost on that and look at cost and benefit so that it can be made explicit. For ecosystem services such as climate change, you might have to educate them about it. They might see changes that they don't necessarily know why they are experiencing the changes. But I just want to say, depending on the scale, but most of the time the communities, they understand, they don't need education.
Thank you. All right, we have another question that asks about how to communicate about equity and ecosystem services to perhaps not an academic audience. So have any of you had experience explaining to people the value of this kind of work, especially, I think this might be reflective of our current situation, especially if they're unsure about the value of science? Does anybody want to jump in? Otherwise, I can point to someone. Leah, do you have any thoughts?
Sure, yeah, I think I'm thinking of some work that a colleague, Pua'ala Pasqua, did in Hawaii. She developed a kind of Hawaii ecosystem services based framework, which focused on Hawaiian values. And she never used the term equity per se, but in creating a framework that was more in line with how the communities she was working with relate to their environment and conceptualize their relationships with their land, I think in essence elevated, the concept of ecosystem services in their mind to incorporate the values that they care about. I can type her name and happy to send out her paper, but I don't even know if you need to use equity per se, but it's in that context, just using terms and being able to better represent what people care about. I was at a meeting where she presented her results, and one of the community members said, this is the first time I feel like my voice can be really heard at the table in policy context. So she kind of created a framework that could communicate some of those values.
Yeah. And I don't know, to add on to that, Jacqueline, do you ever teach the environmental justice framework? What is it that sort of resonates with your students in that regard?
Yeah, so I'm teaching a course on environmental justice in conservation and development. And we talk a lot about intersectionality, and we practice that in our class as well. So that's quite an exciting and helpful setting to start with, especially with international students that all come with different experiences and knowledges. But I was also still thinking of your question, how to contact local people with, or policymakers also with the notions of justice and ecosystem services. And these concepts are heavily burdened with connotations, so I sometimes would prefer to describe what I mean based on what people have told me beforehand. So, for example, I had difficulties translating the word justice into other languages sometimes, because there are so many different concepts that all talk about different aspects. So I'd rather circumvene the use of these heavily connotated notions. Does this
okay, thanks. Yeah, no. And then we don't have that much time left, but we have someone who asked a question about how to deal with equity trade-offs and Leah, this might have a little bit to do with some of the spatial prioritization that you talked about, but they say there are always going to be winners and losers with ecosystem services. What are ways to approach these situations that might not always be win-win?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of non-win-win situations. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a kind of concrete way. I do think, in the case of targeting for a payment for ecosystem services, it doesn't work well to come up with where we should work without knowing people, right? At least in the context I've seen, unless you're a kind of wealthy or landowner who's well connected to institutions already and understands, and it trusts that nobody's going to take their land away, or is, has less of a complicated history with the state and institutions, it's unlikely that people are going to say yes to a program without having a strong relationship with people. So I think sometimes studies, I'm a little suspect sometimes of studies that look at equity efficiency trade-offs, assuming that they can do whatever they want on the landscape, right? So no, it's not always going to be win-win. You're not going to be able to get your perfect alignment with where is the most, where is the most economic need, with where's your greatest gain for ecosystem services. But I think where we can find synergies is where communities organizing on their own to protect their own resources, and where can that align with programs like water funds that are trying to protect the watersheds in which those communities live. I don't know if that's win-win, but I think that's like practical alignment of different stakeholder goals. But yeah, I mean, it may be the case that water fund or a downstream water user wants to protect an upstream area where most landowners are wealthy. So if one of your goals of the water fund is to reduce poverty, there's going to be some kind of trade-off there, and that has to be a negotiation.
Thanks. Yeah, in the real world, sometimes win-wins just aren't always the way things shake out. So we're running up against the end of our time here today. I want to just give the opportunity for all our panelists, if there wasn't anything they felt like they got to address in the questions, in their answers, for them to say some final remarks. But I'll just hold off for 1 second if there's anything you wanted to squeeze in before we sign off today. All right, if not, then I will just thank everyone very much for being here. Thank you, Jacqueline, Benis, and Leah, for being a part of this panel. We really appreciate it. And I hope everyone learned a lot. I know that I did. And we also hope that everyone can log in next week to hear part 2 of this conversation as we continue. So thanks very much for being here, and have a great morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for organizing.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lydia. Thanks, Benny.
And thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Leah. Thanks.
Bye.